Hello, I'm Rod Dreher. In earlier videos, we talked about what the Benedictine monastic order did for Western Christianity and what we Christians today, even Orthodox Christians, can learn from them about how to live more faithfully. After all, St. Benedict of Nursia, who was born in the late 5th century, is an Orthodox saint too. In the next two videos, I want to share with you a short history of disenchantment, that is to say, how we in the West arrived in this religious crisis engulfing our civilization. It is a long and complex story, and I can only give you the bare outlines here, but you need to know this in order to read the signs of the times. There were 6 events over roughly the past 1,000 years that delivered the West into this crisis of unbelief. The first one was the Great Schism that separated the Eastern Church from the Western Church. This happened in the year 1054, when the Pope and the Patriarch of Constantinople mutually excommunicated each other. This allowed Western theology to develop free of Eastern influence. In time, this led to the rise of Scholasticism, a highly rationalistic theological approach that brought the work of Aristotle into Christian thought. To radically simplify matters, Thomas Aquinas and the other scholastics made faith more a matter of the head than of the heart. Even so, the Western Church did not lose its belief that matter and spirit interpenetrated each other. It understood this process in a somewhat different way from the East, but it maintained this strong connection. Medieval Western man experienced the world sacramentally. That is, he believed that God was present everywhere and revealed himself to us through people, places, and things through which his power flowed. The power of sacred places and the relics of saints had such potency to the medievals because God wasn't present in a vague spiritual sense, like a butler watching silently over a manor house. He was there, writes the contemporary philosopher Charles Taylor, as immediate reality, like stones, rivers, and mountains. Taylor says there were 3 basic pillars of the medieval imagination. First, that the world and everything in it is part of a harmonious whole, ordered by God and filled with meaning, and all things are signs pointing to God. Second, that society is grounded in that higher reality. And third, that the world is charged with spiritual force. Note well that the Orthodox Church still believes these things. In the West, though, these 3 pillars had to crumble before the modern world could arise from the rubble. And crumble they did. It started in the 14th century when a Franciscan theologian called William of Ockham, yes, the same guy who invented Occam's razor, challenged scholastic teaching. Ockham feared that the scholastics diminished God by binding him too closely to reason. Ockham offered a theory we call Nominalism, which denied that matter and spirit interpenetrated each other. He thought that matter was dead and had no intrinsic meaning. It was not grounded in God's existence. After Ockham, the so-called natural philosophers, thinkers who studied nature and were the precursors of scientists, began to shed the metaphysical baggage bequeathed to them by Aristotle and his medieval Christian successors. They discovered that you didn't need to have a philosophical or theological theory about a natural phenomenon's being in order to examine it empirically and draw conclusions. Meanwhile, in the world of art and literature, a new emphasis on naturalism and individualism emerged. Art became less symbolic, less idealized, less focused on religious themes, and more enamored of the life of man. What emerged in the 15th century was a new individualism, a this-worldliness that would culminate in the historical period called the Renaissance. Renaissance is a French word meaning rebirth. The Renaissance marks a distinct change in European culture, which shifted its focus from the glory of God to the glory of man. The Renaissance was full of optimism about human nature and its possibilities. Renaissance humanism began to consider the world through classical insights and emphasized the study of poetry, rhetoric, and other disciplines we now call the humanities. Though humanist culture was not as narrowly focused on the faith as its medieval predecessor, it was by no means anti-Christian. The Renaissance brought into Western Christianity a greater concern for the individual, for freedom and the dignity of man as bearing the image of God. The danger was that Christian humanists would become too enamored of human potential and man's capacity for self-creation and lose sight of his inclination towards sin. This was a temptation to which the sensual Italian humanists were particularly susceptible. By contrast, the humanists of Northern Europe were more modest in their piety and restrained in their optimism about human nature. They were more drawn to Scripture than to philosophy, and concerned primarily with reforming the church toward a more rigorous morality. They viewed with skepticism, even disdain, the sensuality that had overtaken European life, especially in the church. Renaissance Rome was a cesspit of vice, and the corruption reached far beyond the papal court and the Vatican walls. Many bishops were despised for their worldliness. Drunken and ignorant parish clergy, indifferent to the gospel, were disrespected by their angry flocks. As they hemorrhaged moral authority, the clamor for change rose. It took an Augustinian monk named Martin Luther to shatter their illusions, and with it the religious unity of the West. The Reformation, as we call the revolution he started, was not the first protest movement against Catholic corruption, but it was the first to hack at the theological and ecclesiological roots of Roman Catholicism itself. Luther aimed his formidable rhetorical canon at Rome's entire structure, defining sin, forgiveness, and church authority. In 1520, the church excommunicated Luther for refusing to recant his belief that Scripture alone, as distinct from Scripture and the authority of the Roman Church, was the source of Christian truth. Thus was the Protestant Reformation born. The Reformation destroyed Christian unity and stripped those under its sway of many symbols, rituals, and concepts that had structured the inner lives of Christians. Reformation-era Christians, Protestants, would no longer bow before what the Reformers believed to be superstition and idolatry. Scripture was their only authority in religious matters. But whose interpretation of Scripture? No Reformer believed in private interpretation of Scripture, but they had no clear way to discern whose interpretation was a correct one. The Reformers quickly discovered that casting off Rome's authority solved one problem but created another, and this problem has still not been solved. Because religion was inseparable from politics and culture, the Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation quickly led to a series of savage wars that shredded Europe. To be fair, the wars of religion were as political, social, and economic as they were religious, but the religious basis for the wars called weary European intellectuals to explore ways of living peaceably with the schism between Rome and the Reformers. So let's recap. The West began to fall into disbelief with the Great Schism of 1054, separating the Eastern Church from the Western Church. Then, the scholastics of the Latin Church created a highly rationalistic model of the faith. The complexity of scholasticism did not withstand criticism in the 14th century from William of Ockham, whose teaching severed the connection between spirit and matter. The Renaissance brought forth a cultural rebirth and a new focus more on the glory of man and less on the glory of God. It was a more sensual age and a less spiritual one. The Roman Church became very corrupt. In Germany, a monk named Martin Luther rebelled against this corruption and against Roman theology, sparking the Reformation, which shattered the religious unity of Europe. And that brings us to the second half of the story of the West fall into disbelief. We will explore that in the next video.